Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about Agikuyu chief who seemed to have been so keen on working with the Europeans, but then he ended up being conned so many times, and he was conned up to, we can say, just a few months before his death. And I'm talking about Karuri Wagakure. Now, I've mentioned Karuri Wagakure several times in other videos. I've mentioned him when I was talking about details that we can find in the diary that was written by one Richard Maynard Sagen. And Richard Maynard Sagen is mostly known as the British soldier who ended up killing Koitalel Arap Samoei. He came here in 1902. He was assigned to, of course, control Africans, and he went to central Kenya, that area, and that's where he met Karuri and other chiefs or other leaders of the people, and then he later on went to Rift Valley or to the Nandi land, where he ended up leading an army that killed Koitalel Arap Samoei. Now, I've mentioned Karuri specifically when talking about the story he provided to Richard Maynard Sagen about the origin of the Agikuyu people, where he tells him that they came from the north and they are related to the Maasai, Akamba, and the Ndorobo. I've also talked about him when talking about Wangu Wamakeri. Now, Karuri, of course, like most other African leaders, it's very difficult to tell when they were born, especially using the calendar we have today, because most African societies used to use a very different form of calendar or way to mark a period. And of course, they used to use age sets as a way to tell when somebody was born. So using the Agikuyu age set system, it is said that Karuri was most likely born in the 1840s. It is said that he was born at a place called Iego. I think it was to the east of the Abadeas. That's where he was born and brought up. Now, it's not clear how he came to be so powerful, because as him growing up, or during the time when he was growing up, the British had not established their control on the land. Of course, there were a few missionary societies or missionary groups trying to convert the people, but this was mostly at the coast and not in the hinterland. So he grew up during the time when the British had very little presence in the Mount Kenya region. But there was a lot of trade going on, especially by the Arabs who came to that part of what we know today as Kenya to pick ivory and then go sell at the coast. But we can theorize, of course, that he, of course, was initiated and then he, of course, rose through the Kiama system. But something else I need to mention is that, and I think I've touched on this a little bit, is that he came from the Ndorobo group of people, and as I've explained in other videos, is that the Agikuyu Republic was a composition of people from very different backgrounds, and the Ndorobo or the Agumba was one of those communities that came and became part of the Agikuyu Republic. And Karuri came from that group. Him and, of course, the husband of Wangu Wamakeri, they came from that group. Now, it is said that, of course, we can, as I've said, we can theorize that he rose through the Kiama system and most likely became an elder through that system. He also served in the military, of course, of the Agikuyu Republic, and he came to hold a very high office. And he held the office that is called Muthigani Wanjama, which means he's kind of like a general, and then he had this other, or it had this other aspect to it, and that is of having some spiritual powers that you use them to guide the military. So that's what he became. And as a young man, of course, besides becoming a soldier and becoming even, we can say, a general in the army of the Republic, he also became very good at doing business, and seems like he was one of the very early people from that region to realize that they could make a lot of money doing business with the Arabs. And he started doing business with the Arabs, and he could collect ivory, and then when the Arabs came along, he could sell the ivory to them, and that's how he made a lot of money. And over time, he became very wealthy, actually. Now, besides doing business, he also came to be known to be a medicine person, or a medicine man, as they were called, and he would be invited to, of course, treat people. And he also, of course, have said that he used this medicine to guide the military, the soldiers at the battlefield. So from him doing business with the Arabs and him becoming like a well-respected medicine person in the community, he managed to become very wealthy. And he said that he married very many wives, up to 60. But this was, of course, common. It's not like he was doing something that was extraordinary. His friend Makeri Wambogo had like 30 wives. That is the husband of Wangu wa Makeri. So it was very common during this time for men to have very many wives, and the wealthier a man was, the more wives they would have. When the Europeans come, they find Karuri already established as a business person, as a member of the community, as a medicine man. He's doing very well, we can say, economically. And then he becomes among the first leaders. We can say he was like a sort of Mutongoria or Mutamaki, because we need to be very careful with how these authorities are described in history, because before the arrival of the British, there was nothing like a chief among the Agikuyu and many other communities in Kenya. What there was mostly council of elders. I call them senates. And then in those senates, you'll have speakers, and these are the people now. When the British came along, they decided to give them these powers or authorities of being a chief, which they did not have initially. Initially, they were just like leaders who guided the Senate in decision-making processes. So he was such kind of a leader. But then now when the British come, initially they started engaging him to get some things done. In particular, it is said that the British Imperial East Africa Company, the company that built the railway from Mombasa to Kisumu, engaged him, especially at Fort Smith, which is, I think, Kikuyu, to provide labor and other resources that they needed to build the railway. And through that, of course, he built networks with the incoming Europeans, and that also helped him grow even wealthier, because it is said that at some point he became like the contact person between the local community or the people around Mount Kenya and the British. And anybody who wanted favors from the British will have to go through Chief Karuri Wagakure. Early 1900s, of course, the British establish more governance structures in the country. And it is during this time that they make him to be a paramount chief. Now he has a lot of powers, and his powers included, of course, acting on behalf of the British. And he also got the powers to appoint other government officials that served under him. And that's how Wangu wa Makeri got to be appointed, or to be made a headswoman, or we can say sort of a chief. And I've talked about this in another video. Now, Karuri died in 1916 in April. And that was like just 3 months after being baptized and being given the name Joseph. Now, I'm going to talk about how he was conned several times. And he was conned because seems like when you read history about him, seems like he was a guy who was so interested in working with the British. He was a collaborator, 100%. There's no doubt about that when you read history. And he was so keen on being friendly with the British who came in, and not just the British, as you will see in the things I'm going to talk about, but also the Italians and other Europeans, and also the Arabs, of course, because he started doing business with them as a young man. There are several incidences in Richard Maynard Sargent's diary where he talks about Chief Karuri being conned, and I'm going to mention like 3 of them, and then there's one that I'll talk about that is not actually in the diary, that is found in other documents. Now, there is a time when Chief Karuri met this guy who went by the name John Boyes. Now, John Boyes was a con. He was a con, and he came to the land of the Agikuyu, and he goes and he meets Chief Karuri, and Chief Karuri at this time is doing business, as I've said, of ivory, and he had a huge stash of ivory at his homestead. And John Boyes tells him that they can do business together, and he should allow him to take the ivory to the coast, sell it, and then he'll bring him his cut of the money, which was going to be a lot of money, actually. Now, John Boyes leaves the Abadeas and goes to Mombasa with the ivory, which was, as I've said, a huge stash of it. And he puts it in a ship and he leaves and he goes to UK. He sells the ivory. It's not described or it's not explained where he sold the ivory, but he sold the ivory. But what's clear, he made a lot of money. And he arrives in the UK, a very wealthy man, and he lives extravagantly. And he started telling people that he was the king of the Agikuyu people. And in fact, there's a book that he wrote, actually. I have a copy of it. I've not had the time to read it, but I'm going to read it because it seems like it's a very interesting book, especially coming from a man who came and then conned, you can say, the paramount chief of the Agikuyu, and then he goes and sells his ivory and then travels in the UK calling himself the king of the Agikuyu people. Richard Maynard Sargent writes this about that. He says that his kingship will cease very suddenly if he ever put his nose into the Karuri's village again. because he says Chief Karuri was so annoyed by this guy. Of course, he's stolen from him. And if John Boyes ever came back, Chief Karuri was certainly going to do very bad things to him. Now, the second time he's conned, that is described by Richard Maynard Sagen, there are these Italian guys who come to him and they tell him that they are missionaries, they are priests, and they call themselves that they are white fathers, and they ask him to give them a place to build and to stay. And he gives them a house, actually, a hut. And they start staying in that hut. But these guys were cons also. They were not actual priests. They were only interested of finding ways to make money out of the people around. And as Richard Maynard Sagen describes it, they started doing roaring trade with the locals. They started making a lot of money. And then he says, and living a most immoral life. He said that they, besides making money most of the time not in a very honest way from the people around, they also lived a very most immoral life, which you can fill in for yourself what that means. This is what Maynard Sagen writes. They have enticed young boys and girls into their mission, and under the pretense of teaching them religion and administering remedies for the diseases from which the children are not suffering, are introducing a code of immorality which is completely foreign to the Wakikuyu. Like they brought in very bad practices, and I'm guessing he's talking about sexual activity that went on with these so-called white fathers. And it is Karuri who invited them. There is also this other guy who cons him, and is a guy who went by the name Smith. And Smith was a carpenter, actually. And Smith did, or Maynard Sagen does mention that he did meet Smith and they did travel together around Mount Kenya. And he says that he came to find out from an interpreter that Chief Karuri was looking for Smith, and he was so angry about Smith because Smith apparently, Smith had converted girls. This is after he had been given permission by Chief Karuri to come and evangelize again, trying to convert local people into Christianity. And Smith comes and he tells Chief Karuri he's a man of God, he's trying to convert people to follow God, and Chief Karuri gives him the permission. But then this guy moves around and he tells converted girls, like this is a quote, tells converted girls that they cannot be true Christians until they have slept with a Christian. So this is what Smith was telling girls, that if you want to be true Christians, you have to sleep with a Christian, which was himself. And so later on, Chief Karuri finds out, and he's not very happy, of course. He's not happy about it. And he starts looking for Smith, but by then seems like Smith had escaped, because the way Richard Maynard Sagen describes it, seems like Karuri was really looking to meet him, and maybe that was going to be not a very so good meeting between the two. Now, the other way that seems like Karuri was tricked or conned by the British or the Europeans in general, because as you can see, these people came from all over the place, is that Chief Karuri was a very wealthy man. And at some point, he became very powerful among the people. He wielded so much authority and so much influence on the land, and so that whatever he said, many people would just follow his word. And the British noticed that, and they saw that, and they realized that, or let me put it correctly, the Europeans, because it wasn't just the British again. They realized that this guy was an authority. And remember, and I've said this in other videos, that the Europeans loved monarchies so much in Africa, because when they came to monarchies, it was so easy to influence how people acted, because all they needed to do is to talk to the king and to persuade the king. And once the king falls in line, everybody else fell in line, because people respected the king. Whatever the king said, well, that was it. But when you come among the Agikuyu, they did not have a monarchy, so it wasn't easy to influence people like it was among the monarchy. So what do? That's how they end, or that I believe that that's why they ended up building these people, propping them up like Chief Karuri, propping them up to become paramount chief, which was, we can say to some extent, trying to make them like monarchs. And they propped them up so that they could use them for that purpose. And they propped Chief Karuri so well and made him such a big figure among the Agikuyu people, such that now through him, they could influence the population. So I say that he was tricked because he was propped up. And then at some point, they put a lot of pressure on him to convert to Christianity. They put a lot of pressure on him. I believe mostly through incentives that they gave him at some point. And it looks like Chief Karuri resisted for a very long time from converting. Like he resisted for a very long time. I could say maybe he resisted for maybe close to 30 years. While he did business with these people, he had deals with them, he served them, he worked for them. For a very long time, he resisted converting. And that's because part of his authority among the Agikuyu needed him to play some very traditional functions, including, for example, being like the medicine man, as they call him, which I can call a high priest, to some of the very critical functions for the Commonwealth to move forward. So for those reasons, he struggled with converting, but there was an immense pressure for him to do so. And so they had propped him, they had made him this paramount chief, and then they put a lot of pressure on him. And finally, in 1916, January 14th it is, he finally decides to convert, and he is baptized and given the name Joseph. And now, here is something else that needed to change. Chief Karuri was a polygamous man. He was a man of his era, men of his age. It was not common to have a man with one wife. But now the British and the Europeans in general are here, and they want to fight that practice, and they want to get rid of it. And they tell him, for him to convert, he needs to basically deny all the 60 wives and keep one. And that's what he does. He declares that all the other women he had as his wives were no longer valid wives, and he decides to get married to one wife who was given the name Consolata after being baptized alongside him. And immediately after the baptism, there was a wedding between Joseph and Consolata. And then he died a few months later in April 1916. He was 80-something, I think 87, around there. Now, why I call this being conned is because I don't think he realized what was being done here. I think he thought these people were doing this because they cared about his afterlife. But I think that's not what it was. It was for PR. They cared so much about having the right arsenal for PR in, of course, converting the people and changing the culture of the people. So they propped him up, and then they put pressure for him to convert, and then for him to say it's wrong to have many wives, and for him to, of course, deny all the wives he had, 60 of them, and just get married to one in the church. And then, of course, he dies a few months later, 3 months later, actually. And then I would say that helped with the PR that followed. And the region was, to a large extent, converted to Christianity, and polygamy died for the most part, and other traditional practices were abandoned. Those are my random thoughts.